Happy Monday, U.S. History. It's time for Chapter 21 and a quiz. So let's get right on that. Hope you guys are well, by the way. Chapter 21, number 1, is from your homework question number 2. What great advantage did the U.S. possess, according to both Churchill and Stalin? Number 2 is from number 15 on your homework. What was the Double V campaign? Number 3 is from number 29 on your homework. Why was the city of Stalingrad such an important target for the Germans to attack? Number 4 on your quiz comes from question 39. On what basis did the court rule in favor of the Japanese internment in Korematsu versus the United States? Number 5 is from number 55 on your homework. What decision caused the Japanese to gain the upper hand in the Battle of Leyte Gulf? And number 6, extra credit, is from number 65 on your homework. Why was William Leahy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, against this new weapon? All right, from there, that's the first part of your Google Doc. Now I'm going to turn it around here to where we're going to have a little slideshow. I'm going to first sort of recap some of the things we looked at last week, and then we'll quickly move on to new material from Chapter 21. And I will ask you some questions based on the material I give you in this little mini lecture. Hopefully it won't go on too long. I got a lot of slides, but I'm going to talk mostly to you and not to the slides, I hope. And hopefully that will come into focus very shortly for you, because that's what I want you to focus on. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay. Well, last week we looked at the beginning of the war and the conditions that led to the war. Here's a picture of Europe and the boundaries drawn after World War I. Much of Eastern Europe actually had new countries drawn. But you see what will become the countries that will fight against one another: Germany and Italy, and Norway, and loosely Spain, against Great Britain, France, Russia, and across the pond, the United States. All right, we talked about this last week when the Munich conference was over and Neville Chamberlain came back with his little piece of paper that he promised the English people that there would be peace in our time. That was just another piece of appeasement, trying to give Hitler what he wanted and not grudge him too much, just so they could avoid a second war. And what Hitler wanted really was an expansion of Germany into areas that were mostly German-speaking, and according to Hitler and many Germans, actually rightfully Germans. Specifically, the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized at the end of World War I. He actually remilitarized it. A little area called Saar, which was not under German control. And then he wanted Danzig the city of Danzig as a northern port and also as a link to East Prussia. We'll go on to see that quickly he will gain all of those. So even before the U.S. is involved in the war, Germany has aggressively taken many of these territories. They've annexed Austria, they've taken the Sudetenland, they've taken over the Rhineland, and basically Slovakia retains its independence, although it basically becomes a puppet state of Germany. Prior to invading Poland, both Hitler and Stalin agreed to a non-aggression pact, and here are two cartoons sort of lampooning this agreement. Here, the groom and the bride. I've never seen an uglier bride than Stalin, with the tagline, "Wonder how long the honeymoon will last." Not very long. And over here, they're shaking hands and smiling to one another, and yet behind their backs they have a pistol. And they're both stepping on Poland, which is the desire of both countries to split up Poland between them. Well, we know that the first fighting took place in Poland after that non-aggression pact with the lightning war of Germany, the Blitzkrieg, which consisted of airstrikes, many bombs, and paratroopers, followed by tanks and infantry forces that just overwhelmed Poland. And you see some of the elements of this war. Here are the infantry coming in and burning, obviously, just farms and farm buildings and residences. And we see here on a map Germany coming in from the east, and to a lesser extent the Soviet Union coming in from the east. And here is a parade through Danzig. I don't know German other than the word Danzig and Führer, Grupt Leinen. I don't know, but all we know from the picture is that Germany has taken over Danzig and all of Poland, and they're celebrating. After the invasion of Poland, of course, Britain and France declare war, and the World War has officially begun. Here's a propaganda poster that shows "Together we march toward freedom." Of course, this is a British propaganda poster, and the United States is, as of yet, nowhere in the picture. One thing I forgot to mention last week was about the invasion to the west. I talked about Poland, but I forgot entirely about their invasion to the west and taking over France, which was their first goal in Western Europe after Poland. Of course, they invaded through Belgium and Holland to a lesser degree, and took a northerly route down into Paris. There was very, very little military intervention. They just basically marched through and took Paris. A couple famous photographs here of officers of the Third Reich marching down the Champs-Élysées. This is Paris, probably. This is the Arc de Triomphe, the Arch of Triumph. Temporarily, at least, it's the triumph of the Germans. And here a very famous photograph of Parisians as they watch, this is a separate photo, but they're watching Germany basically walk into Paris. And obviously emotional moment for them. Truly frightening. So before the United States ever enters the war, we see Germany basically having control over this entire red area. Poland, all this area they've annexed. They basically walked into Paris. They've set up an agreement with a puppet government in southern France called Vichy France that is cooperating with the Nazis, and so they virtually have all of Europe. And of course, these countries, Switzerland stays neutral, of course, and Italy is on their side, as is Spain. Norway becomes a rather tepid ally of theirs, but they don't pay much attention in the war. What is the next real goal for the Axis powers for Germany? And that is Great Britain, the one holdout here. Of course, they're going to be very difficult to attack because they're going to have to be attacked by air, and that is the Battle of Britain, which we see the Luftwaffe of the Germans and the Royal Air Force of Great Britain. And we know, in part because of Great Britain's resilience, because of radar, because of basically hiding when the Germans bomb, that they actually succeed, and Germany basically concedes that they're not going to take over Britain. So that was one of the first Allied victories of the war. Here we see some pictures of London during bombing. I think that's St. Paul's Cathedral in the background, but you see the smoke rising, fires in the background, a woman drinking her tea on the rubble that is her house, and here's a street in London. Just completely decimated, and yet the British do not give up, in part because of their intrepid leader, Winston Churchill, who realizes he needs the United States badly. He needs them despite the U.S. isolationist stance. And we know, and he knew, that FDR was not an isolationist himself, and there are many instances where FDR did an end run around the Neutrality Acts to help Great Britain however they could. And these are some of the things. I'm not going to have you look at them all because that was kind of last week. But FDR did make many choices to help prepare for war in the case that we were going to enter. I should say that isolationism actually did end in the United States once the people of this country did see how both Germany and Japan were expanding rapidly, and that our military was insufficient to meet this tremendous onslaught. I think your book said that we were at the start of the war 16th in military might in the world, behind the nation of Belgium. Well, that would change very quickly because as your chapter opens, it talks about how the U.S. basically rearms itself or arms itself for the first time for modern warfare. Well, both Stalin and Churchill knew that the United States had tremendous capability to expand. And part of that was because of our industrial base already. And much of what we did was built upon the auto industry and our shipbuilding industry. One of the first things that was needed so tremendously were tanks, were trucks, and jeeps. And so many of the auto plants, particularly Henry Ford's Ford plants, converted to wartime production and switched from producing automobiles to these wartime vehicles. And we also used some of those same factories and converted others to building airplanes. One of the striking things to us about Germany's attack on Poland and the Battle of Britain was just how enormous and effective the German Air Force had been. So this talks about Japan now and their expansion. They had expanded before Pearl Harbor to many of these areas, especially in Manchuria in China, in Japan, in Vietnam, and pretty soon they would move down here and take over many of these areas. Here's a cartoon that shows how Uncle Sam is very unwilling to get into the fight between China and Japan, even though the League of Nations, of which the United States was not a member, kept encouraging them to somehow intervene. Of course, we know from last week and from your prior knowledge that the Japanese did attack us at Pearl Harbor, and that brought us directly into the war. In that attack, 2,400 Americans were killed, an additional 1,200 were wounded, and the Japanese sunk 20 warships and destroyed 150 airplanes. Here are some photos from that day, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, says FDR the next day, when he declares war on Japan. Here is an interesting cartoon of the United States and its will to smack Japan. A not very flattering portrait of a Japanese person. It's a downright bad caricature. It almost looks like a Dr. Seuss figure. And we brought ourselves into an alliance that included, of course, our good friend, but would eventually bring in someone who is a very unlikely ally, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. So before we go on, let's talk about, go back to how we converted. The government of the U.S. actually helped encourage manufacturers to convert to a wartime economy. Usually, when you would get contracts for building weapons or arms, you'd go out to contract, and it would be a long process. But what FDR did was just said, no, we're just going to tell people to produce, and we will reimburse them on a cost-plus basis. That is, whatever it cost you to build that tank, that truck, that Jeep, that rifle, that machine gun, we are going to pay you for what it costs plus an X amount of percentage plus for profit. Well, that encouraged everyone to get into the game because they knew that they couldn't lose. No matter what their costs were, even if they were higher than they initially expected, they could always know to be reimbursed completely for all of their costs, including the cost of converting factories to wartime production, plus a guaranteed percent on of profit. Sure, that was not the most efficient way for the United States to encourage people to get into making wartime goods, but it was the fastest way and the biggest incentive to give manufacturers the incentive they needed. And people just built as much as they could because they knew that as much as they built, they could be reimbursed with the cost plus percentage of profit by the U.S. government. And for those industries that didn't have the money to convert their factories, the government also did a second thing. They provided loans to companies to convert their factories from peacetime manufacturing to wartime manufacturing. The other thing that we did was we built many ships because Roosevelt was former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he knew that we were woefully inadequate for fighting a war, let alone a war on two fronts. So he also did the same thing with shipbuilding, and a guy named Henry Kaiser, who you learned about in your reading, built the Liberty ships, the welded ships rather than the riveted ships that had prefabricated parts that were brought together. What did it say? An initial production of one of those took an incredible amount of time, but it was brought down to like 30 days that each one of those ships could be built. By the middle of the war, it said that I think 30% or almost a third of the ships were built from one of Henry Kaiser's shipyards, one of his Liberty ships. The other thing that the United States did was they instituted. So that's basically tells us about preparing the arms and armaments for war. And here's your first question. Name one action on the part of the federal government to expand production rapidly. Here it is again. Number one, I just talked about it. Name one action, I named two, that the U.S. took to expand industrial production, that is for wartime, rapidly. I named two things. All right, the other thing we did was we instituted a peacetime draft. First time in history. Many young men volunteered, but we also drafted, and it was widely approved by Congress and by the population of the U.S. And because many people saw this as a real threat to American liberty. It also, the draft brought out some of the dark underside of our culture and some of our problems. That is that while Black Americans were drafted, they were drafted into separate units, and women were not drafted. They could join, but they were never put into military combat. We're going to see some advancements by the end of the war. Many of the bases are going to be become integrated, and it will lead eventually in 1948, after the war, for Harry Truman to totally integrate the U.S. military. So these are baby steps in the right direction. All right, let's go on to the early battles. Of course, one of the things we did not want to do, but we had to do because Japan had attacked us, was we needed to fight a two-front war. Here it actually shows us, here we got two fronts. Here's the one front, Hitler and Mussolini, and the other front is Japan. I guess that's the Emperor Tojo. And of course, the first person we really needed, the first nation we needed to fight was Japan, because they attacked us. And no one was basically fighting against their aggression. Shows right here the line of Japanese expansion. They kept moving outward with very little opposition. Well, I got to go back for a second because I got to tell you briefly about the story of the Philippines. On the same day as Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, the Japanese took over the Philippines. And your chapter tells about how easy it was to take it over and how they basically forced back into the Bataan Peninsula the U.S. troops that were stationed there and wouldn't surrender. They finally did surrender and forced them on that long death march, the Long March, the Bataan Death March, which involved 78,000 troops, of whom 10,000 died during that 65-mile walk. One of little of many tragedies of the war. 10,000 of those U.S. prisoners died on that walk to the prison camp. The only thing we could do in the meantime was to try to bomb Tokyo, which we did to try to demoralize them, which it did, and we did so with our biggest bombers, the B-25s. The bombers were so big and required so much fuel, and we did not have any bases close enough to Japan, that we actually had to, after bombing, land in China. No problem for the Chinese, because they were against the Japanese too, and so we were an ally of theirs. And it did really shift Japanese, it did really put the Japanese on the alert that the United States was within, that their homeland, especially Tokyo, was within striking distance. And so what they had to do is try to move the U.S. so that they didn't have any bases close enough that they could fly in any bombers. So they kept trying to take more and more islands out into the Pacific. And two areas they wanted to take were New Guinea, which we had control of, or Australia did, and also Midway Island, which was in the North Pacific, was our most westerly holding and place for an airstrip and a port. Midway is just a very, very tiny island, something called an atoll, which is, you couldn't build a town on it even, but they had a base there, which was helpful for refueling and for getting planes to these other islands. So anyway, the two first battles are going to be down here close to New Guinea and then on Midway. And in the Battle of the Coral Sea, that is the one that was regarding New Guinea, it was basically a draw. Here we see a battleship being blown up. I think that's a U.S. battleship being blown up. But the cool thing is that we were at a great disadvantage in that situation, both in terms of our sea power, our number of our ships, and our positioning. So the fact that we could at least keep them from taking the southern side of New Guinea was a victory for the U.S. On the other hand, here's the little atoll of Midway. We effectively ambushed them on Midway. They could have taken it very easily if it weren't for one thing. And this is also why we came to a draw in the Battle of the Coral Sea, is that we had broken their codes. And the codes that they were giving for both of these battles, we knew exactly where the location of their ships were and where they were intending to send them. So we knew everything about the location of each ship and their intention with every ship. That is a great advantage in a modern war. Well, in any war, but so we were ready for them in Midway. And in the Battle of Midway, by the way, this is not an actual photograph, but it's from a video game, I think. But it does show just sort of the mayhem and the terrific amount of firepower that we put on the Japanese. I should say that, I think it's obvious, but in World War II, it is not... Naval battles are not about two ships going and firing on one another. It's about airplanes taking off of ships and attacking ships. So it is really, there was no Air Force at the time. The Air Force and the Navy were inextricably bound together, but it was really about airplanes bombing and striking warships. And anyway, in the Battle of Midway, we effectively sank 4 of their biggest aircraft carriers. It was a huge disaster for the Japanese. All right, back in Europe. Meeting with Churchill and FDR, where are we going to attack? Well, Churchill wisely thought that the Allies shouldn't really attack directly into Germany, except for airstrikes into Germany itself to demoralize them, but that they were not ready for an attack. He called for a peripheral war. A peripheral war that would basically take areas on the edge of Germany's new empire. Um, and where he chose to start was actually in North Africa, which Germany had taken over. Here we see a U.S. Plane over the Great Pyramids in Egypt. So the first big battle, was won by the UK at El Alamein, just west of Egypt, which was a huge victory. It's over here. Where is it? Over here, right there. Boom. It's west of Cairo. And the U.S. landed in near Casablanca in Morocco, and both the U.S. moved eastward to try to take over North Africa, and the UK moved westward, and they met up finally in Tunis, but unfortunately there was a battle that the Axis completely creamed us at. It was at Kasserine Pass. Eisenhower, the U.S. commander, fired the person in charge of that battle, and basically put General Patton, who has become very famous in history and in lore, over the troops in North Africa. Anyway, we mopped up in North Africa and took the Germans out. Meanwhile, Germany, still feeling pretty darn confident, says that we really don't want to fight a two-front war. What we have to do is get rid of our enemy to the east, that is, the Russians. And what he said, I like this quote of his, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He thought that about many cultures. He thought that about Poland, which was true. He thought that about Russia, which wasn't true. And anyway, he thought foolishly that he could easily take Stalingrad. Why Stalingrad? Stalingrad was one of the most distant cities within reach. Well, what Hitler thought was, don't hit the capital cities. Don't necessarily hit the place where maybe the largest civilian population is. Hit where it's going to hit their economy the worst, okay? Where their economic production is, where their industrial production is. And Stalingrad was a huge industrial city. And if Stalingrad could be taken over by the Germans, then much of the production of the Russians would come to a halt. So that's why he chose Stalingrad. Unfortunately, by the time he got to Stalingrad, it was winter, echoes of Napoleon. It's really hard to beat the Russians in winter on their own turf. They surrounded Stalingrad, but Stalingrad would not give up. And in the meantime, additional Russian troops surrounded the surrounding German troops. So finally, after a couple months, the Germans surrendered. And like 90,000 troops, I believe, German troops had to surrender, and they went to basically labor camps in Siberia, and a majority of those German soldiers, now prisoners of war, died and never returned to Germany. It was a great disaster for Hitler, which is actually no disaster at all. It's pretty awesome, except for the lives of 91,000 German young men. Here we have some more, I guess, women fought. But here, the Russians are fighting in their white uniforms that are very cozy and lined with fur. And in the meantime, the Germans are basically freezing to death and eventually being surrounded and sent to labor camps. Sorry, Nazis. All right, where's the next place that the Allies are going to hit? Well, we're going to hit what's called the soft underbelly of Europe. Hey, wait. Question number 2. We're going to go back to Japan here. Number 2, what was one great advantage that the U.S. had in fighting Japan in both the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway? Remember, it was about knowing something, not about firepower or troop size or something. What one great advantage did the U.S. had in fighting Japan in both the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway? Remember, it involves some aspect of intelligence. Intelligence as in Central Intelligence Agency, knowing about the enemy. Hint, hint, hint. Okay, so after the Battle of Stalingrad, or sort of concurrent with it, the Allies try to take the soft underbelly of Europe. They try to take Italy. They first take over Sicily without too much difficulty. Here they are, soldiers landing on the shores of Sicily. and then it's mainland Italy, which is going to be a much, much harder thing to attack and take control over. Politically, it was easy because basically Mussolini was called in by the king of Italy, and the king of Italy said, "We've got to sue for, we've got to try to come to terms to surrender because the Allies are going to beat us." Anyway, Mussolini was refused. He was taken under arrest. He would later be executed. And who was it who came in and basically defended Italy? It was the Germans themselves. So there were German defenses that were lined up to meet the Allies after they had taken Sicily and were now hitting mainland. Here we have some scenes of Italy. It shows a little bit about not only the destruction, but about the hilly terrain of much of Italy. And this map is very hard to see, but it shows Allied advances and how slow it was to gain ground. With that slow advance, we also see that there was an incredible cost of life in Italy. Here's a cemetery in Italy. Interesting. All the crosses, you see a couple stars of David showing up here of some of the Jewish people from Italy who died in here. 175 people died in Italy. In Western Europe, Italy had by far the highest number of deaths. That's interesting. Not Germany, not Great Britain, not France, but Italy. The Italians were the ones who cost the most in war, and part of it was the Allied invasion of here. We already talked about the Battle of Stalingrad. Oh, in the meantime, there's a tremendous Allied bombing of Europe. Allied bombing of Europe especially. We'll see where these red marks are. Guess what country they're in? They're hitting all aspects of Germany. Here we have United States bombers and some of the damage that they wrought. The bombers were not only hitting industrial centers, but they were also hitting areas of population. Now we come to the Tehran meeting, where the big three, you can name them: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill. Where's his cigar? Does he have a cigar? He always has a cigar. I don't see it. And then Stalin, who is, at least for the time being, our ally. Soon to be our enemy again. But for now, he's our ally. And basically, they agree that they're going to attack France. And Stalin agrees to wage war on Japan after Germany is defeated. Things are looking up for the Allied cause. Now, what is the attack of France? Well, it's what we know of as D-Day. And it had been long planned for several years by Dwight Eisenhower, and there he is right there talking to the troops shortly before, and by the British troops as well. And Germany knew that we would attack northern France. It was just across the English Channel. So how do we show an element of surprise? Well, there were some environmental conditions that we knew that we had to meet when we crossed the English Channel. And some of these were: we need to hit the coast of France at low tide. We needed to advance at night so they could be undetected for the most part. There needed to be moonlight, however. It couldn't be a new moon. It had to be at least a partial to full moon for paratroopers so they could see in the night, so they could know where to land before dawn. And there, of course, had to be good weather. That is, there couldn't be storms or choppy seas. It would make landing very difficult. What else? I think that was it. But you know what? The night before, they were planning on going either on one of 2 or 3 nights. And the first night that they could have gone, the weather was bad. The second night, the weather was iffy, but Eisenhower said, yeah, we're going on the 5th of June, I believe. That is the night of the 5th of June into the 6th, which was D-Day, 1944, where troops of all kinds entered right on this area of the coast of northern France, called Normandy. Interestingly, we had set up lots of sort of dummy troops and we had set up radio frequencies that we knew were being interfered with by the Germans, that basically gave false information about attacks here, about attacks here on this little promontory where most people thought we would land. Or over here was another very likely place for us to land. So they duped the Germans into thinking they might land over here, or most likely over here, when really, this was our chosen target. And In this Operation Overlord called D-Day, we're going to see some slides just to show just the effect. I mean, just the enormity of the invasion across the English Channel on D-Day. With a few photographs. Get close to the shore, they cross the English Channel, open up the gate, and out go the infantry. Of course, before that, we were sending paratroopers down and many aircraft to bomb as many German holdings on the north coast of France as we possibly could. But these people, look at this scene. I mean, this is enormous. These craft landing infantry, and they're also landing tanks and artillery and other troops, trucks of all kinds. Here we even have a tent, a Red Cross tent set up. It's almost, they immediately land, and they're beginning to set up. Here we actually see, I don't know why, doesn't that look like those are parachutes? They still look like they're over the ocean. I don't know. Anyway, but we also see a lot of firepower. We see smoke here and fires, and we see it out here. Many of the people who would have landed would have said that, well, 1 out of 3 men, I think, were killed before they even made it to shore, at least on some of the beaches. The Omaha Beach, which was the most difficult one to get. And after they landed, they had to take over they had to go up a cliff, and many cliffs, and along a 28-mile stretch, and take it over. Here we see them rising from the beach up to the promontories over them, which were well guarded by the Germans and had to be taken out by anti-aircraft fire. Here's a picture of paratroopers who are going over. Look if you can see their fear in their faces. I don't know if you can see that, but I see fear and anxiety in their faces, knowing what they're about to do, that they're going to land behind the lines of German troops in enemy territory, and they're going to try to take over northern France. And there they go, by the thousands, in the pre-dawn hours. And land they do, and take over the northern tip of France they do. Now their goal is going to be from here, going eastward into Germany, while the Russians come westward into Germany that way. And we will see this shortly. Is there something I missed? I'm sure there is. Let's do a question. Let's do 2 questions. Let's go back a little bit. Number 3, why did Hitler decide to attack the Russians at Stalingrad? I talked about that a little while ago. Why Stalingrad? If you can't find it in the video, you can always go to question 29 on your homework. And number 4, what were some of the environmental conditions that were needed for the troops to cross the English Channel and to make sure that we had everything right on June 6th? I named about 4 or 5 different things that involved, well, you can figure it out. Involved various things. It wasn't just weather, but that was one of them. Okay. Anyway, we see a lot of troop movements. We don't have to worry about this. Eventually, we're going to find our way to Germany, and of course, FDR, is going to die in April, not long before Germany surrenders. Here's Berlin, and how effectively we have bombed it into, so that Hitler is living in a bunker underneath the streets of Berlin. But let's get back to Japan, because we do a lot of island hopping, just so we can get close enough so that we can get bases where we can attack the island of Japan more effectively. The 2 most important most important islands, I guess, were the Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where they were heavily fortified by the Japanese. In Iwo Jima, that's where the flag was raised, that iconic image of Americans raising the flag. That was on Iwo Jima. 6,800 Marines died in that. And on Okinawa, the next battle, getting a little bit closer, let's see, where are these places? Come on, where are you? I can't find them. Okay, maybe you can on a map. Okinawa, which was just 350 miles from Japan, a base from which they could attack mainland Japan very easily. Um, 12,000 people died. 12,000 Americans died. Anyway, after we had island hopped and basically retaken many of these islands that the Japanese had originally had, we were bombing Japan regularly. And many people thought that the Japanese were about ready to surrender. Um, but one sticking point was whether they could keep their emperor. And there were lots of views on what to do with Japan, whether to keep conventionally bombing them or to use this brand new weapon which we had developed. Well, it wasn't brand new. You know what I'm referring to. It's the atomic bomb. All through the 40s and actually the late 30s into the 40s, they had been working on splitting the atom because they knew that when you could split the uranium atom, you created a great amount of force. And at the University of Chicago, it had been effectively harnessed for energy. They had split one in the city of Chicago in a lab. It was a well-fortified lab, and the Germans were working on it. The British had been working on it even before the war, and finally it was brought over and promoted by the U.S. government in what was called the Manhattan Project, where the top atomic scientists in the world worked to build a nuclear warhead. That is a bomb that could that was powered that would split atoms when it was dropped. On July 16th, they effectively detonated the first atomic bomb in a test over New Mexico. We also did a couple, I think, in the South Pacific, and we knew that it was ready to go. By now, Truman is the president, and he was sort of saddled with the question of whether or not to use the atomic bomb. And he decided, of course, to do so in two places. But I wanted to actually read his reasons for doing so. This is from him, and it's actually from your textbook. This is Harry Truman talking. Having found the bomb, he's talking actually in the future about having used it. Having found the bomb, we have used it. We have used it against those who attacked us without warning at Pearl Harbor, against those who have starved and beaten and executed American prisoners of war, against those who have abandoned all pretense of obeying international laws of warfare. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. So that was basically his rationale for having used the bomb. Of course, we know that the bomb. Oh, this is people getting out to wage conventional warfare in the islands before we use the bomb. Okay, look at those huge transports and the number of men that they can carry. Oh, this is also when they were island hopping, was when they could use, when kamikaze pilots basically were used for the first time. Here's a Japanese warplane aiming directly for that ship, and you see the anti-aircraft guns on that. Here's one that I think has been hit and is not going to be effective. Here's one that actually effectively hit. And here is the airplane that dropped the first of the nuclear bombs. It's called the Enola Gay, and you might have seen it already. It's not too far away from us. It's at the Udvar-Hazy Museum up in Manassas. It's a museum of the Smithsonian, and you can actually see the actual airplane that dropped that first atomic bomb. It's kind of freaky to see, to know what kind of havoc was dropped, what kind of maelstrom and destruction was dropped out of that plane. And here is the crew of the Enola Gay. There's the mushroom cloud from an atomic bomb. There's ground zero. This is what it looked like before Hiroshima. This is what it looked like afterward. Get ready for some photos of a city that has been destroyed. Well, we dropped the bomb, and after we drop the bomb in Hiroshima, we do not hear again from the Japanese. They do not surrender. So 3 days later, we drop another bomb in Nagasaki. Similar destruction. It's not quite as much destruction, but we're talking about 100,000 lives in Hiroshima and 50,000 lives in Nagasaki. People who oppose that use of the bomb would say, why did we kill so many innocent people? In fact, William Leahy said, in my opinion, the use of this barbaric weapon was of no material assistance. Going down, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. Well, when 100,000 people died in Hiroshima, 50,000 died in Nagasaki, but Japan then surrenders unconditionally and World War II ends. I think we need a couple questions before we finish up. Here we go. Maybe we just have one more. We do. We just have one more question. And that question is this. What were Truman's reasons for saying, yes, I'm going to drop that atomic bomb on Japan? All right, we're done. Have a good week, guys. Thank you so much for your submittals, for doing this, and for doing this U.S. history class in this very compromised way. See you next week.